ora, and welcome to the Marlborough Book Festival podcast, the place where you can hear writers talk about their work, their lives, and the inspiration behind their writing. I'm Sonia, the chair of the committee. This year's festival was a fantastic weekend, and we are eager to share the recordings with you very soon. In the meantime, enjoy this engaging session from the 2023 Book Festival.
Right, everyone, let's get this underway. My name is Marcus. I'm from Lawson's Dry Hills Winery. We're one of the sponsors for this event, amongst several other wineries, and we're really proud to be involved in this event. It's been so well run, so well attended. The authors have all been so interesting. It's just an absolutely fabulous event, and we couldn't be prouder really to be involved. So thank you to all the organisers. Thank you guys for all coming along. It's made it a really wonderful weekend. Over to Ron and Pete. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. You like that, Maggie? Yeah. I've been working on it, but I do find g'day a hell of a lot easier to say. So, on to our session. A little bit about Ron. Tēnā koe, Ron.
Tēnā koe, Pete.
I've had the pleasure of knowing Ron ever since we arrived in Marlborough, which is in the mid-70s, about the same time. Oh. Luckily for all concerned in very different professions. We happened to be bit players in a well-known cricket team, the United Country, and when they were short of players, they would ask Ron, and if Ron couldn't go, they'd ask me. So we never got to bowl, and we always 11th man, I think, you and I, and we were always dropping catches on the outfield. But if they were really desperate, we did get a chance to play together. And cricketing was not your strong sport. You were far better at golf. Squash. You tried to teach me squash. Anyway, Ron spent the first 30 years of his working life as a court lawyer, much of it in the resource management field. And he says one of the biggest decisions he ever made was to leave a thriving practice in Auckland to come to a small country town. However, as he described it, most court work was always looking backwards at past events, while resource management was looking forward. And Marlborough then had many industries, including the wine industry and forestry and aquaculture, in their infancy. And it was a pretty exciting period. And he did find that work fascinating. In 2011, he was appointed a member of the Waitangi Tribunal, where his deep knowledge of Maori history was no doubt invaluable, and his contribution was, we know, significant. So, Ron, we're pretty fortunate to get you to Marlborough. Well done. And you dragged Margie down with you too, so that was a good effort. Yeah. So this book, Te Kooti's Last Foray, some of you may have read it, and I hope you will all read it after this. But it's Ron's 9th book. His first, written in 1999, was the epic Musket Wars, followed by Gilbert Mayer, Te Kooti's Nemesis, Andrus App's Odyssey in Images, Albonetta, Lost Opportunity at Casino, and NZSIS, The First 50 Years, followed by A Desperate Dawn, The Battle for Turuturu Mokai, Kupapa, and the last one, The Forgotten Wars, Why the Musket Wars Matter Today. An important and I believe very significant aspect of your writing, Ron, is that wherever possible you have ground truthed the stories. And I doubt few other historians would have done this so diligently. And we'll hear a bit about the significance of this today. And while you allude to some of your experiences in your ground truthing trips, for all your books. They are in their own right worth a story on their own. I think there's a few of us here today who've experienced trips into the bush with you and could help with the episodes and those stories if you do write a book. So that's a opportunity for your next 10th book. Or have you got one on the way?
Oh, I'm just taking a bit of a breather at the moment. Yeah.
So, Te Kooti's last foray. This is the extraordinary story of Te Kooti's abduction in 1870 of two whakatahe communities from the Opotiki area here down into the Wai or Eka Gorge, right, which is down here, and of two Army Maori manned and led contingents from Army supported the Whanganui, who came up this way to catch up with Te Kooti and the Ngāti Porou, who came over from the Gisborne area, and Te Kooti, who took the captives down into this area here. So, but firstly, Ron, could you tell us a little bit about Te Kooti himself? He was quite a character. He was a warrior and a spiritual leader, and must have been an amazing character in his own right.
Yes, he certainly was. But possibly, really, before I do say that, I just would like to observe that it's a bit overwhelming to sit here and look out, and there's a lovely Māori word, to feel whakamā, to feel humbled. And I'd just like to thank you all for taking the time on a terrible day to come outside and come along and listen today. And I hope that it's that I can hold your attention for at least the rest of the hour that we've got. But turning back to Te Kooti, he was a very charismatic leader. He, as you've said, he was a spiritual leader and a warrior. That he was a somewhat reluctant warrior in a way, in that he'd initially, in 1865, when the Paimariri or the Ho-Ho movement had broken out and swirled around the East Coast, he was involved in fighting alongside the government forces. The next year, because of various jealousies, Pākehā and Māori, he was unjustly accused, unjustly imprisoned on Foray, which is the Chatham Islands, and with 350 other Paimariri captives there. And they had to endure the hardships of building their own accommodation. They had no trial, they had no finite sentence, and they were stuck out there with no future ahead of them. He masterminded the capture of the supply ship 2.5 years later, and they sailed back to the Gisborne coast intending to disperse and go back to their homes. But the second they landed, they were attacked, and attacked repeatedly by government forces. They were successful in rebuffing those attacks. They then, for various reasons, known probably only to Te Kooti, they were involved in 3 really pretty brutal raids on Turanganui, Gisborne area, Whakatane and Mohaka, where they killed as many Māori as they killed Pākehā. So he made a number of enemies immediately in the Māori community as well, which becomes important for the purposes of this book. He was then pursued. He was rebuffed by the Māori king, who felt threatened by him, and was engaged in campaigns throughout the central North Island, and then made his way back under pressure back to the Urewera, which is the large, huge area of some 600,000 acres of heavy bush country that's basically located between the Napier-Taupo Highway and the Opotiki-Gisborne Highway, which is the Waiweka Valley. And the Waiweka was where he went back to, and he then engaged in the events that are the subject of this book, where he took 218 Whakatoia people from just east of Opotiki and took them back 45 kilometres back into the Urewera. And the events of this book then occurred. He subsequently was pursued for the next 2 years in the Urewera, managed to escape, managed to make it to the Kingitanga, into the Upper Tainui area, and he was able to live there peaceably under the protection of the Māori King at that stage for the next 10 years of his life. He was pardoned in 1883 as part of the peace arrangements that were entered into with Tainui. And he then embarked on a spiritual campaign, really, where he went back to all of the areas, with one exception, Gisborne, where he wasn't allowed to go back. But he went to all the other areas where he'd fought and where he'd killed people, but this time with a spiritual message. And the reality is, and the conclusion I express at the end of the book, is that in the end, he won by spiritual appeal what he'd failed to achieve by force and abduction during the course of the wars.
Thanks, Ron. So why did you write the book?
Well, the Urewera Valley is just part of a fascination that I've had both New Zealand history but also New Zealand bush country for ever since I was about 15, really. I've been going into the Urewera since I was 15. When I think back now, my one particular mate of mine and I, we were spending 6 weeks, when you think about it now, we were spending 6 weeks a year in the bush from the time we were 15 through until we finished our university period, and then continued on, and that was mostly in the Urewera, and we continued that on really for the rest of our lives. Margie thinks that I've got an obsession with the Urewera, but I was there with Margie actually last week again, and we went to some of the sites where this book is about, and walking the land and going to those areas. And in 1987, for example, I remember having a sabbatical leave, and our kids were quite small, and Margie didn't agree, but I went in the bush rather than going overseas, and went in the bush on my own for in this particular valley, in the Urewera Valley, for 2 weeks, walked up to the head of the river, and then first time I ever saw a chopper in the bush was when a helicopter came in with a bloke who fortuitously is now the artist who's done the illustrations for this book, Stuart Spicer, a bloke who lives in Foray. And the first time I met him was when he stepped out of a helicopter at the headwaters of this Urewera River, and he very nearly got killed the next second because the chopper had its runners in a fern-covered clearing, but I knew it had a step in it. Stuart didn't. He grabbed a box of supplies to come up, and one of the things you don't do when you get out of a helicopter is go up, and he went up, and I remember thinking he was going to be killed. The noise of the chopper, you couldn't say anything. He survived, which is a delight, because he's a wonderful artist, and he's done me a huge favour in terms of this book, and he's taken most of the photos as well.
Thanks, Ron. So why do you think Te Kooti abducted, and they were, it was 218 older and people and children from Marumutu and Pape. He had a lot of followers in the area, and a lot of people who were sort of allies. Were they actually captives, or were they just following him?
Well, there's a couple of good questions really in there. The reason why I think he went there, nobody's ever going to know, but I suspect that he'd had a bit of a hammering in the central North Island. He'd lost at one battle site, Te Kooti, he'd lost 37 people were killed. At various other locations, he'd lost 4 or 5 here and there. He'd lost a lot of men. He'd gained some things. He'd gained a lot of ammunition, a lot of weapons. He'd also gained about 150 horses that he had with him in the Mamaku Ranges to the east of to the west rather of Lake Rotorua. And he was attacked there by the Whanganui, and they shot 45 of the horses that were lined up like cavalry horses, and they captured the other 100 and took them out to Tauranga. So he lost most of his horses. He still had a few, and so he was really after resupply, really, of men, particularly ammunition, weapons, horses, he was pretty short of all of those by the time he got back across the other side of the Urewera to Maraetahi, which was the pa that the Ngāti Ira people had pulled back into in 1865 when they were terribly attacked by the Crown for the killing of the Reverend Balkner. And so they had offered him a haven. That was his haven, and he braided out from there 45 kilometres, come on back with the Whakatoia people. The young Whakatoia men at Ōpapia and Ōmaramutu had actually joined the Whanganui contingent, about 34 of them. So there was no opportunity for them to defend themselves against Te Kooti. It was really just there were about 50 older men. The rest were women and children of the 218. There would have been hapu women, there would have been pregnant women, there would have been little kids. And the journey that he took them on was seriously tough.
So did he have a plan where he was going to take them?
He did. When you get... Can I just possibly borrow that, Peter? And just go back one if I can. When he took them from this location, his is the green route, when he got down to here, he split the force. He and his soldiers went down to Maraetahi Pa, this pa here. The captives were taken up to this location. There was no pa there at the time. They had to build their own pa, and there was about 100 of his supporters with them. So 323 people were captured by the Whanganui at that pa. And there were another 6 puni or camps made here, which would have been to ensure that these people couldn't escape. And at Maraetahi Pa, the reason he'd gone there was that this chap, Hira Te Popo, who was the rangatira of Ngāti Ira, the people who'd suffered this appalling attack by the Crown. When the Crown attacked them, not only them, they were one hapu of 6 hapu of Whakatoia. Balkner got killed. The Crown's reaction, instead of finding the people, just the few who killed Balkner, the Crown attacked Whakatoia generally and confiscated 450,000 acres or 440,000 acres of their best land, noticeably only their best land, forced them into 2 little reserve areas, Ōpapia and Ōmaramutu, and another place called Hibaro on the Ōhiwa Harbour, except for this chap. He said to hell with that and took his people up to the Maraetahi Pa as a refuge pa.
Okay. Thanks, Ron. So how are they going to live there? They didn't have a pa to go to, and they had no, I presume they had no facilities or taka or anything like that.
No.
And it was getting on towards winter, so...
Yeah, it was late March, and as I say, we were just there last week again, but if you go there, you wonder how on earth he could have thought that 300-odd people could live at that location. They were big gardens at Maraetahi Pa, and so Stuart Spicer has tried to indicate at the bottom right there the size of the gardens, which were described as being over 10 acres in extent, and they comprised potatoes, maize, taro, and there was an account by one of his followers of food being taken from that location up to Waipuna Pa, but it's a big walk and a massive climb over a massive hill to get up there, or trying to wade your way up the Waiaweka River, which in most conditions is not easy. And quite extraordinary that he expected them to survive the winter. And I think that had they not been released by the attack on Waipuna Pa, I think a lot of them might well have starved. I think it would have been a very, very difficult winter, because there were already at Ngāti Ira, there were about 100 people probably at Maraetahi Pa permanently, been living there for 5 years, those were their gardens. And then suddenly along comes Te Kooti with another 100. So there's a couple of hundred people at Maraetahi Pa, and there's another 323 up at, or more, up at Waipuna, and all expected to live off bush food, which in those days would have been a lot more plentiful than it is now. There would have been, there was tuna or eels in the rivers. There was, there would have been heaps of whio, blue duck. There would have been heaps of, kiwi. Sounds a terrible thing to say, but there would have been. But in reality, that number of people was too great for the bush surroundings to have supported.
Okay. Can you tell us a bit more about the two attacking groups, two forces that were after him? That's the Whanganui and...
So the two Whanganui leaders were on the left, Te Kooti Huinui, who was Major Kemp in the Pākehā accounts, and to the right was Tōpia Tūroa, who interestingly is holding a pātiti or a tomahawk, which becomes important later on. He, the chap on the right, had fought for the Paimariri against the government in the upper Whanganui River in the earlier years, but had some of his relatives in the Lake Taupo area killed by Te Kooti. So he changed sides. And those were the two commanders of the Whanganui contingent, which comprised about 530, 550 odd people when they left Whanganui. The river was up. It was raining. It was early December. It took them a month to get up to Taumarunui. And then they sent 65 men back down, the older men, to take 130 men came back down with the waka. So we know there were 65 waka that took them up the Whanganui to Taumarunui. And then the other 400 walked their way around the lake, around Lake Taupo, across the Waikato River, and then had engagements with Te Kooti and the Mauku Rangers. And then went out with the horses. That's where they got the horses. And then they went out to Tauranga. And then they were taken by ship to Ohiwa, and Ohiwa Harbour, which is between Whakatane and Oporiki. Ngāti Porou had a really challenging, well, that was challenging enough. Ngāti Porou went into the Urewera, the red line, and they had to go up and over Mangapuatu, which is the second highest peak in the Urewera. And that was a sacred or tapu area for Tūhoi, never been entered before by government forces. And they went over Mangapuatu expecting Whanganui to come up and meet them. But Whanganui, as they'd been heading up the Waimana River to meet up with them at Mangapuatu, had entered into a truce or a rongopai with a chap called Tama Kōwha, who was the Tūhoi rangatira of that valley. And so they did that walk. When they got to Mangapuatu, they heard about the truce. They weren't very happy about it, but they acknowledged it and accepted it, went on down the Waimana, and when both Whanganui and Ngāti Porou, within days of each other, arrived at Ohiwa, they heard that in the previous week, Te Kooti had carried out this raid just along the coast and taken these 218 people back into the bush. So they then had to head up those two rivers to try and retrieve them.
And this was Samuel Austin?
Yeah, well, what had happened was the previous month, as Te Kooti was coming back to the Urewera, he was attacked by Gilbert Mayer and the Ottawa flying columns, and in a day-long running battle of over 42 kilometres, so over a marathon distance, they'd shot about 23 or 25 of Te Kooti's people. And the previous year, these settler forces, armed constabulary Pākehā forces, had had very little success and inflicted hardly any casualties on Te Kooti at huge logistical cost, though, in terms of supplying them. So Maclean, the Minister of Defence, decided that as from the 18th of February, 1870, the previous month, that only Māori forces under Māori command would be involved in the pursuit of Te Kooti from then on. And it caused a political hoo-ha, that's written up in the book, because a huge number of, particularly the Otago papers, were saying the government's lost control. This is crazy. How can Māori, how can they pursue Te Kooti and be relied upon? And so he had 2 or 3 weeks where he was very exposed politically until Te Kepa and Ngāti Porou managed to demonstrate that his decision was very wise. And so no Pākehā were to go, with only 2 exceptions allowed. One was Samuel Austin, who was a very experienced Imperial Army NCO living in Whanganui, and also this chap in blue, who was Lieutenant Thomas Porter. And they each kept a diary, and those diaries become central to the book. Yep. And the leader of the Ngāti Porou was Ropata Wahawa. His proper name was Rapata Waihoa, but he was captured during the Musket Wars by Rongawhakata and was enslaved. Maclean, he didn't ever like the name Raipata, which was given to him by Rongawhakata. Maclean couldn't pronounce Rapata, even we can call him Ropata, because he had a Scots accent, and Ropata preferred that. So he always called himself Ropata from then on.
Ropata.
Aye.
Hi, I'm Kate Te Kooti. I'm a writer and a publisher and a reader.
Awesome. And what do you think of our Marlborough Book Festival?
Well, it's one of the great festivals in the Southern Hemisphere because it is so carefully thought through. It has superb content, very carefully curated collection of writers and presenters, and then it looks after everyone at the festival, writers and the participants and the audiences, so beautifully. Wine is very present, which is of course wonderful, but everyone stays in the most beautiful surroundings and are looked after. Every need is looked after. And then there's just the communion of writers and the communion of writers with their audiences. I've had such good conversations with people after various presentations. So it's an absolutely top happening for me, yeah.
So you've uncovered the true story of what happened, and it's basically Austen's diaries, not this guy Porter's account.
Aye.
What led you to become suspicious of the history in the first place?
Right. Well, look, I wrote that Kupapa book in 2015, and these events were right near the end of the Kupapa book, and it was in an area that I was very familiar with. From having been in there in the 1970s on numerous deer stalking trips, and then again in that long extended trip in 1987. And yet when I came to read the accounts were by the Whanganui rangatira, and they were saying that they had attacked this pā site called Waipuna Pā and released all the whakatoia. Their reports were published, they were brief. Porter's diary was published in full. He was an officer, and in those days being an officer mattered, and so his diary got published. Austen's didn't. But Porter said these events all occurred at Maraetahi and that Ngāti Porou had carried them out. So I couldn't reconcile them. And James Cowan, who'd written the New Zealand Wars histories in the 1920s, he'd accepted Porter's account. Porter was an officer. This was purportedly a contemporary diary. Dame Judith Binney, who wrote the brilliant books on Te Kooti, she'd accepted Porter. And so I didn't know how to do it. And I really didn't feel comfortable when I finished the Kupapa book about these events. And then about 3 years after I'd written it, in about 2019, I think it was, a woman called Barbara Mabbott, who I've only just met in the last week with Margie, and turns out she's 90 years old. She's a neat old thing. And she wrote a book on her relative, Samuel Austen, and she detailed his diaries. And so I wrote to her and asked her, could I have the diaries? And she kindly made those available. And they disclosed that Whanganui clearly had attacked Waipuna Pā. It was 14 kilometres away from Maraetahi Pā. And they attacked it the day before Ngāti Porou arrived at Maraetahi Pā, and it became very obvious that Austen was correct and Porter wasn't. And the more you walked around in their footsteps, trying to satisfy myself and my companions on those walks that Austen was right, the more convinced you became. If Austen said there was a creek there, there was a creek there. If he said you went up this ridge, you went up that ridge, and it all worked.
Well, much of your book covers this ground truthing that you did. With ex-army guys, and there's one of them here today, I think.
There is, yeah. And those walks were, I'm now 74, and those walks were, for me, pretty hard. And it was neat to have those blokes along.
I'll get you to describe or show the terrain that you and they had to go over.
Right.
And how tough it must have been for the captives to actually get there, being older men and women and little kids. Yeah. So we've got, here we are.
Yeah. Well, that just shows part of it. So one day, and the chap who's present here now is pretty typical of ex-regiment blokes, ex-SAS blokes. He's extremely humble, hell of a nice chap, and so I won't make him stand up and make himself known, but he is there. Oh, well, there he is. Right. So if you could just go back to that previous one, that day we walked from there. Austin said that you came up the Tutaitoko River to a creek called the Raitakahia, which is where that creek is that you're looking at, and then you climbed up a ridge, and then you got to a place where you had to, he, in his diary, he said you had to climb hand over hand, etc., and that was moving from one ridge system to another, which we needed to get onto this system called the Ropor Ridge. Yeah, next one. And then you went up and down over numerous ups and downs, and Chris Gray, the chap in that photo, he had a fancy watch with him, which at the end of the day was able to push the button, and it told us that we'd walked, I think, 25 Ks, 10.5 hours, and we'd made 1,500 metres of elevation, so close enough to 5,000 feet going up and down through the course of the day. And that's what all those people had to do. It just shows how tough they were. Yeah. And then at one stage in his diary, Austin recounted that they got stuck up on the ridge one night and they had to spend the night up there, and they spent 26 hours without water. And he described that they could see the silver moon shining on the river below, and we just happened to get to one little piece where we could get that view down to the river. So you can see the elevation that we've climbed. And then they came on down, and he described hitting this creek, and sure enough, when you come down the ridge, that's exactly where you hit. And Stuart Spicer captured the moment, which I think was a delightful sketch. So then if you could, just on the left-hand side, you can see us coming down, that's right, and they hit a river called the Omo Kora, which flowed down, and what became crucial to us was that he described them then coming to the Three Rivers Junction. And you can see the three rivers. They came down the Omo Kora, they hit the Waiaweka, and then they came up and they hit this river here called, then in those days called the Tāhora, now called the Opato, and that's the main highway through to Gisborne. So this location that you're looking at is nowadays called Wairata. This was a little school that is now closed called Wairata School. And if you climbed up on the high point where the helicopter's actually sitting, the view that you got was really you're looking at in the other direction. So that's looking north. And this one here is also looking north, but this one's from further up the river. So he sent them all the way up to what I believe is the power site that we discovered, and at the mouth or the junction of the Te Patoa stream. So the high point that he said that the scouts climbed up and could get a view up the river, that would have all been bushed. There would have been tiny little clearings where there were 6 puni or temporary camps and in one power site, and the power site was immediately below out of sight of the camera. And then they attacked those through the night, and then in the morning at dawn they attacked this power, which is where they released the 218 whakatoia, and there were about 100 odd of Te Kooti people as well there. And they killed 19 in the attack on the power, and as they were going up there, all killed by the tomahawk. No shooting at all. So pretty tough stuff, but very effective.
So they basically sneaked up at night to Waipuna, yeah.
And they were had scouts out in advance, were taking each individual puni as they went.
Yeah.
And so pretty horrific for the people being captured, etc. And but warfare was brutal. The sabre was as brutal in Pākehā hands as the tomahawk or the pātiti was in Māori hands.
And this is the Waipuna Pā.
Yeah, look, if you could, on the left-hand photo, that's Chris Gray there, and he and I were walking further up the river to prove that the Waipuna Pā wasn't further up the river, about 2 hours walk up the river. And we got to that point, and there'd been a horrendous rainfall the previous day. The Waiaweka River was tremendously flooded. And he said to me, we need to go over to the Te Patoa Junction. And I was already feeling the weight of the pack. And I said to him, no, let's just carry on up to the hut. And he said, no, if you're going to write a book about it, you need to go and have a look, And so we walked over there and we had to go through on a brake-fed fence. And I remember saying to Chris as I went through the fence, this isn't brake feeding, this is mud feeding, because there was grazed so low down, which was brilliant, as it turned out, because it let us see the topography of the ground. You only need about that much grass and you can't see these Foray depressions. But if you look hard, you can see the Foray depressions. And as soon as we walked out there, we started seeing dozens of them. And then I came home and told Margie that we'd found the par site. And Margie said to me, what evidence you got of that? So I showed her that and numerous other photos. And she scornfully said, just looks like a flat paddock to me. What are you going to do with it? And I said, I'm going to put it in the book. It'll proves that we've found the par site. Margie said, no, it doesn't. It just proves you've walked across a flat paddock. And, and then the next day, you came around and said to me, and could you go back to the previous photo? And you said, I told that tale of woe to you, and you were completely unsympathetic. And said to me, well, have you got any other better photos of it? And I said, well, I've only got one. And I said, I was actually getting a photo from a chopper, and I was getting a photo up the Te Kooti stream, because I knew that's where Te Kooti, he liked that area. And I said, but fortuitously, we got the terrace in at the bottom of it, and that's the location. So you asked me to show you that on the computer screen. And then you brilliantly said to me, you've blown it up. And I said, no, I hadn't. And when we blew it up, next photo, can you show the next photo? On the right, it's very hard to see, but you can see the Foray sites all started to stand out, and particularly 3 lines on the right-hand side that I hadn't seen before. And so the next day I went round and saw Ethel Anderson, Dr. Ethel Anderson, the esteemed archaeologist who now lives in Blenheim, and asked Ethel to have a look at it, and gave him a memory stick, and he did exactly what you and I had done the previous day, but he had a bigger screen. And as it blew up, he sort of physically rocked back and said, this is a site of major Māori customary occupation. And I said, how do you know that? And he said, well, you can see the lines of all the Foray, and they're all basically in line. But he said, what's absolutely common in all the par sites is that as they cleared the par site, they would clear the stones, and they would use them to demarcate, and he said, not sure whether it was between crops or between whānau, but they would use them as demarcation lines, and you can see those garden lines off to the right. And so Stuart Spicer turned that into a sketch showing the garden lines up the top, and the night after the attack on the par, while they were still sending out patrols trying to pick up those who'd got away from the attack, it rained heavily, and Austin, in his account, said that he used the phrase, I had to pig in with 100 others. So we knew that there was a very large Foray, which Stu's shown in the middle of that reconstruction.
Yeah. So going back to Ngāti Porou and their attack on Maraetahi Pa, why did they, and that's where Te Kooti was, why did they fail to capture him?
Well, they'd arranged with Te Kepa that they'd just come across the Urewera, so they were absolutely stuffed, and they arranged that they would go up the Waiaweka River to attack Maraetahi Pa, which is marked with the yellow X on the bottom right. But they hit a gorge 2 kilometres below it, where the red cross is, and if you go back to that gorge, the scene of that gorge, they were coming up we know they were coming up the true right, which is, when you talk true right, true left, it's what's the true flow of the river. So they're coming up, if you're looking at that photo, they're coming up the left-hand side, the true right, and they're the red ring. They are fired on by 2 of Te Kooti's, a picket that he'd put in place, and they heard the firing up at the par. Te Kooti immediately sent another 20 down to reinforce these 2, and Porter doesn't say it in his diary at all, in his published account or in any of his accounts. But Tuta Niho, who was another Ngāti Porou rangatira who was with him, says in a Māori account, ka whakamuri mātou i taua, and ka whakawhiti, so we dropped back down the river and we crossed over the river. And he said wha mairo, which is 4 miles. You've got to divide that in 2 because they counted their footsteps there and back. but they dropped back 2 miles, came back the other side to the red ring on the other side. They're able to fire across at the picket and break through and get to the pa. And that all took 2 hours. By the time they got to the pa, Te Kooti had gone, and so had all his followers. So Ngāti Porou actually shot no one. They wounded 2 at this location, but they took no prisoners, they killed no one, and yet if you read Porter's account, they killed everybody, they released the whakatoa, they did everything. And Whanganui gave them a bit of a help.
I'm very conscious that we're running out of time, Ron.
Right.
You basically covered what Te Kooti got away, and you briefly covered what he did. And most of what Te Kooti did afterwards is in Gilbert Mayer's book. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Broadly.
So we won't go into there. But in the book, 1,100 Maori walked out of the bush after the relief.
Took them 2 days.
Yep. And there were 218 whakatau here.
Yeah.
Who were the others?
There was 450 whanganui plus allied iwi. So that included some young whakatoa. That also included Ngāti Awa from Whakatane and Whānau Panui from the Te Kaha area. So 450 odd in the whanganui contingent, 300 odd in the Ngāti Porou contingent, and then around about 150 or thereabouts. Somebody will be doing the quick maths, and I'll have it wrong, but about that in the of Te Kooti's followers. And so it came to about 1,100 Māori who came down the Waiaweka after these events. It took them 2 days to get out.
They sort of straggled out.
Oh, yeah. I think they were all pretty hungry and all pretty, particularly the Whanganui and Ngāti Porou, pretty sore and tired. They'd been campaigning in hard country for months by this stage.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I think is there anything else you wanted to add to the story?
Well, I do, really, because you insulted me at the when I sent you the last photo. Do you want to say that?
Oh, we haven't got to that yet.
Oh.
That's the climax of the whole interview. Time for questions. Have we got a microphone somewhere? Have we got any questions? I think there's a mic on the way.
Rob, could I ask, was there any kaitangata in that, those forays?
And Carl, no, there wasn't.
Thank you.
Yeah. Kaitangata means eating of people, all right? So the answer's no.
Tēnā koe, Ron. Very, Te Kooti, people say Te Kooti, but it's Te Kooti. But amazing man. And my grandmother, she was brought up by Rui Maniapoto. And my father got the name Rui Maniapoto from the Maniapoto tribe. Now, when she was a young girl, she can remember Te Kooti visiting the old fellow. So that's one of the memories she told us about that gentleman.
Aye. And that would be a period when he was developing the Ringatu religion.
That's right. Aye. And that was down at Te Kooti, in that area.
Aye.
Thank you.
Some 20-odd thousand people at the last census gave the Ringatu religion as their religion. So quite a mark that he's made on the country. There.
Kia ora, Ron.
Kia ora.
That was really very interesting. I know that we have a whānau connection to Te Kepa, and I'm not really the one who can explain it. You probably do know about it, or perhaps Pete or Lawrence might be able to, but I was really interested to hear about his role. Do you want to say anything about that, or do any of my cousins want to say anything about that?
Well, probably the thing that I could indicate is that, as is made very clear in the book, both Te Kepa, Topia Turo, and for that matter also Rupata Wahawa, they were, what often springs to people's mind is why were they fighting alongside the Crown? And I emphasise it was alongside the Crown, it wasn't for the Crown. They were fighting for their own hapu reasons, to protect their own lands, because their lands, both on the East Coast and at the Whanganui, were at great risk of being confiscated by the settler government, because the settler government had passed legislation which enabled it to say, some of your hapu rebelled against the government, and so we're going to take your land, regardless of whether you were in rebellion or not. The perception from Te Kepa's viewpoint and from Ropata's viewpoint was that the best way of ensuring that you didn't lose your lands and weren't devastated in that way, which they'd seen happen in the Waikato and in South Taranaki, was to fight to try and protect the order and peace that was promised by the treaty, but would sadly have been breached by the Crown.
Kia ora, Ron. Just an acknowledgement, firstly, your contribution to New Zealand historiography is significant, and I know that in the course I teach, the New Zealand Wars, the Musket Wars, Gilbert Mere and Kupapa are on the reading list. So this one will be going on the list as well.
Oh, thank you, Pete.
I suppose a question I have is when I was going through university, there was kind of a shift in how people like Te Kooti and Te Tukuwaru were framed in the historiography. So prior to that, the rebels were demonised. And then there was a swing, and I think it was Ballach had a bit to do with it, also because we were gearing up for Waitangi Tribunal investigations and those kind of things. So there was a shift in kind of favour, or there was a shift towards more sympathy, I suppose. And at the same time, people like Ngata falsely were kind of framed as sellouts. And now we kind of have a situation, I think your work's, because you've dealt with both so-called rebels but also kupapa, where we have a situation now where there's both have been kind of rehabilitated to a sort of a situation where you have both kupapa and those chiefs who fought against the Crown kind of, I don't know how to express it. Maybe you can help me, but one's not seen as evil and one's not seen as good, but they're kind of. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, look, and I agree with the point you made that there's been a significant change in the attitude historically towards people like Te Tokowaru and Te Kooti, and you don't have to read very much history in reality to realise that there were some terrible things done. If Te Tokowaru's people lost all their land, and how on earth could you then survive? And a point made early in this book is that what often happened for Māori who faced that terrible situation of being devastated, losing all their lands, all their ability to survive and provide for their families and the like, that when the very entity which had guaranteed to them that they'd look after their land and that they would look after their forests and their rights to their food and resources, was the very entity that was attacking them and invading them, for example, in the Waikato and South Taranaki and the like. When you lose the ability to go to any proper constitutional entity which will protect your rights that you have, what happened with Māori very commonly was that they turned to religion. And so that led to the Pāmiriri religion just sweeping across the central North Island because of that. And it also led to Te Kooti being very successful with his Ringatu message in due course. And really, it's not an error as such, but you can understand why, when he was attacked in the way in which he was, you can understand why he fought back. His perception was he was fighting back against a very evil, and it was a very evil situation that he was facing, he was pretty brutal about the way he did that. And that put him offside with a whole lot of iwi throughout the centre of the North Island. And the consequence really was the Kupapa forces that pursued him. But they were pursuing him to... There's a general failure to perceive nowadays that Māori then had two very different views of the benefits of the treaty or the detriment of the treaty. Some who fought against it saw it as being a method of repression and of their rights, and others knew and recognised the benefits that came from good order and trade and religion. And religion was very important in those days, much more so than now. And those were all good things that had apparently come with the treaty. So they had not only aligned themselves with the Crown to ensure protection of their lands, which they shouldn't have had to do, but also because they genuinely could see some benefits from the treaty relationship. Those who suffered badly at the hands of the Crown, understandably, took a very different view and fought against it. Te Kooti and Te Kooti amongst them.
Simple one. Did they then have to walk all the way back again to Whanganui?
No, they got taken back by ship. So they took the prisoners down to, the prisoners were dropped off, 31 of them who were charged. They were sentenced to death. In those days, the sentence was horrendous. It was a sentence of being hung, drawn and quartered that the judge had to pronounce upon these men, and then that was commuted. So, in fact, by 1870, so these events were March 1870, by, I think it's in the book, but I can't remember the exact date, but it was 1871 sometime. By that stage, everybody had been released, which was a great outcome. And Ngāti Porou were taken back by different ships. Yeah, they went back by different ships. And on their ship was Maclean and a chap called Clark, who was the Commissioner for Native Affairs. And they went ashore at Hicks Bay and signed a memorandum acknowledging that the claims in respect of confiscation of East Coast lands would be abandoned, or Ngāti Porou lands, and Whanganui got the same assurance from the Premier Fox after they got back home to Whanganui. Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
Kia ora. I'd just like to make a point that when our dear monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, took the throne, Ron and I were going to school. And a very similar thing to what you've just been talking about was happening in Kenya. Exactly the same thing. Ron knows exactly what I'm talking about. There's a book called The History of the Hanged. There were 16,000 Kenyans butchered, hung or butchered, because of exactly what you're talking about. And most of us people in this room don't know that. So this carry-on was still going on 90-odd years later. Thank you.
It's a process called colonisation.
It's called colonisation.
Ron, what do you think the reaction of Maori is to a Pākehā writing a Maori history?
Yeah, it's a naughty question. I have been in touch with Ngāti Eda, who are the hapu who is rohi, the Waiweka River is in, and touch wood, so far, they're still speaking to me. And they very kindly, at a recent thing where Stuart Spicer had done a magnificent drawing of one of their rangatira, which Margie had framed, and we took up and met with them, and I presented that to them, and they gave me back a quite neat tanikaha stick. When tanikaha, what they do is, in the Waiweka, is every couple of years they'll cross the river, there's a tanikaha grove in the bush, and they'll twist a young tree into a circle and tie it into that position with flax. And 10 years later, they'll go back, cut off, and you end up with a tokotoko, or walking stick, that is in a circular shape. And they kindly gave me that. So hopefully I regard that as a bit of a token of acceptance. Look, there'll be some people will have a view that it's for Māori to write, and I just happen to be the bloke who was privileged enough to have had a life where I've spent a huge amount of time in the bush, and I've spent a lot of time in the Waiaweka, and to me it was very easy to understand the documentation that I came across. So I would hope that might be respected, but I don't know.
Thank you.
We'll find out.
And finally, here's a little Pākehā gnome walking through following Te Kooti's escape route.
And that was on a long day that's described in the book, and in an appendix on following their footsteps. And those SAS fellows walked me that day for 15 hours, and we ended up in the dark, and we ended up, we just had day packs, and that night I had 2 sardines for dinner and 2 sardines for breakfast, and they were very kind, and they lent me their drinks and lent me whatever. Well, they didn't have any food either. It was a bit of a mission, but it was excellent, because one of the other SAS blokes that I've kept in touch with since writing the book on them is down south, and he rang me up and said, you've got to write that up, and I said, well, I can't really, because the blokes might not want it. And he said, oh, no, but it demonstrates, and he'd read the book in draft, and he said it demonstrates better than anything that you've written and the rest of the book, just how hard these Māori people were, who were taken on these massive walks. And so that walk was walking, for those who have got an interest in the Urewera or might know it, that walk was walking over from the Waiaweka River over to the Waimana River, because in the book up till then I had said that it appears possible to do this in one day. And I wrote to these SAS blokes and said, are you interested in trying to change one word from appears to is? And they wrote back keenly and said, yes, we're very keen. And so we did this massive walk, and we changed one word from appears to is.
Very important.
Right.
Yeah. We've got a minute or two. Can you tell everyone here why they should read this book? What are there are some significant sort of factors involved in the story. So,
well, I think it relates to a big area of the North Island. It particularly relates to some terrible events in 1865 when the Crown attacked Whakatoia, and those events are largely unknown outside Whakatoia's area. But to have all your good lands taken from you because one Pākehā gets killed, not by possibly some Whakatoia, who knows, but largely by Pāmiriri who'd come over from Taranaki, etc. So it was a gross breach of the treaty protection, that the Crown was supposed to protect these people and their lands, and yet attack them. For Ngāti Ira, they suffered the last cavalry charge where 9 of their men were cut down by sabre, and out of about 150 people, 30 or 40 of their men were killed. It was a horrendous situation that they were facing, and no wonder Hira Tupōpō took them back up the Waiaweka Gorge to try and get some refuge from what they were suffering. So, to me, the events are dramatic. They're quite gripping, and they're quite and the whole mystery really of what I've called the Porter myth added to it as the book research went on. So I would hope that it informs people about an area where the drama of the Crown's breaches of the treaty were demonstrably horrendous to those who were affected, and you see the reactions, the turn to religion, the turn to try and resistance, and you see the outcomes, which we haven't got time to discuss, but you see the outcomes. And, last month, Whakatoia got a settlement which was pathetic when you think of 450,000 acres of land being confiscated. But it's pitted them one against the other as hapu. It's not a happy situation. And I think it's important for us as a nation to know that that was our history and not to try and ignore it. And one of the sad things in some of the more recent histories is that these events of the New Zealand Wars, so by very good historians, but for some crazy reason, they don't even mention it. So the last two books that have come out on the New Zealand Wars, one by a Pākehā, one by a Māori, no mention of these events at all. So one has a map of the significant events in the pursuit of Te Kooti from 1868 to 1872. The Urewera River isn't even shown on it, and Portuguese is not shown on it, and these events aren't even discussed. So that just shows you how easily things can be overlooked for whatever reason. So to me, it's important for Ngāti Ira, but for all of those iwi who are affected, Te Arawa from Rotorua, Ngāti Awa from Whakatane, Whānau Apanui from Te Kaha area, Tūhoi, and let alone the Whakatoia themselves. It's very important that they have this history recorded. It's equally important that Pākehā are aware of what occurred in these events as well.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks, Peter.
Well, I think that about draws it to a close. First of all, thank you, Ron. Brilliant. And thank you for all your effort and all your ground truthing and all your work you've done finding out these stories. It's
well, thank you, Pete, for having the brilliant suggestion that we blow up that slide.
Well, thank you for not. And thank you, audience, for being here and listening to Ron. It's been great. Thank you very much.
That was another great conversation from the 2023 Marlborough Book Festival. For more information about the event, head to marlboroughbookfest.co.nz. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes soon.